Morality is not what we claim. It is what silently governs us when no one is watching. Long before markets became the language of power, Adam Smith saw something deeper. When the world still believed humans were driven only by gain, he revealed a more unsettling truth. We do not merely seek profit. We seek to be seen as worthy. We measure ourselves through the imagined gaze of others, and in that invisible courtroom, our real life unfolds. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Smith did not ask how wealth is created. He asked a more dangerous question. How can humans live together without collapsing into selfish chaos? The answer is not comfort. It is tension. Between desire and restraint. Between self-interest and moral judgment. Between who we are and who we believe we should be. Today, in a world of endless consumption and silent comparison, this tension has not disappeared. It has intensified. We perform more. We reflect less. We chase recognition but avoid self-examination. And so the question returns, sharper than ever. What actually governs you when no one is there to approve or condemn? To answer that, we must step into the architecture of Smith's thought, not as economics, but as a map of the human soul. Chapter 1 opens as a confrontation with a truth most people refuse to see. Human beings are not rational calculators first. They are creatures bound by the capacity to feel into the lives of others. What we call morality does not begin with rules. It begins with the unsettling ability to step outside ourselves and witness another's inner world as if it were our own. Before modern psychology had a language for empathy, before behavioral economics dissected decision-making, Adam Smith had already seen deeper. When the world still believed that human action was driven either by cold reason or blind self-interest, he exposed a third force, a force quieter but more decisive. The capacity to imagine another's condition, not to copy their emotion, not to dissolve into them, but to reconstruct their experience within the theater of one's own mind. Sympathy is not emotional contagion. It is an act of construction, a deliberate projection, a mental crossing. You do not feel what another feels by instinct alone. You simulate it. You rebuild their pain, their joy, their fear inside yourself. And here lies the first rupture. If morality depends on imagination, then morality is fragile. It depends on how far you are willing to go beyond yourself. Most people never go far. We like to believe we understand others, but do we actually leave our own position? Or do we simply reinterpret others through the narrow lens of our own comfort? To understand another human being, you must betray your own immediate perspective. You must suspend your instincts. You must ask a brutal question. What does this experience look like when I am no longer the center? And most people refuse that demand. Smith reveals that moral judgment is not given, it is earned through effort. the effort to correct the distortions of our own perspective, the effort to admit that our first reaction is almost always incomplete. We do not naturally see clearly. We see from where we stand. And where we stand is always biased. This is the first fracture in the illusion of moral certainty. We think we judge fairly. We think we know right from wrong. But what if our judgments are nothing more than projections of our limited imagination? What if what we call justice is simply the boundary of our empathy? Here the structure becomes clear. First, there is the self, immediate, partial, defensive. Then there is the other, distant, obscure, resistant to full comprehension. Between them lies imagination, and that bridge is unstable. Smith does not romanticize this process. He exposes its difficulty. To imagine another's suffering is not comfortable. It demands that you interrupt your own narrative. It demands that you feel something that does not serve your interest. And here is where most people retreat. They reduce the other, simplify them, judge them quickly, because true sympathy is labor, and the human mind avoids labor when it can. But without this labor, morality collapses. A society without cultivated sympathy does not become neutral. It becomes distorted. People begin to overvalue their own pain and undervalue the pain of others. Near suffering feels intense. Distant suffering feels abstract. And so injustice grows not always from cruelty, but from imbalance of perception. Today, surrounded by information, connected across continents, we might assume this problem has been solved, but it has not. It has deepened. We see more, but we feel less. We scroll through suffering without entering it. We witness without reconstructing. The modern mind consumes human experience, but rarely inhabits it. Technology has not expanded sympathy. It has numbed it. We no longer lack exposure. We lack depth. We do not ask what it truly means to be that person. We ask how quickly we can move past them. And so the moral imagination shrinks while the illusion of awareness grows. This is the paradox of the present age. We are informed, but not transformed. Smith forces us back into the core question. If you cannot imagine the inner life of another, what exactly are your moral judgments built on? Habit? Culture? Convenience? Fear? Strip away the language of ethics, and you find something uncomfortable. Most judgments are not conclusions. They are reactions. Fast, defensive, shallow. They protect the self more than they seek truth. And here the existential dimension emerges. To truly sympathize is to destabilize yourself. You must allow another person's reality to challenge your own. You must accept that your immediate feelings are not final. You must confront the possibility that you are wrong, not intellectually, but morally. This is not easy. It is not safe. It demands a form of inner exposure. And so the human being stands in tension. On one side, the desire to remain centered, certain, protected. On the other side, the demand to expand, to imagine, to risk distortion of the self. Sympathy is the battlefield between these two forces. Most choose safety, but safety has a cost. When you refuse to imagine others deeply, you reduce them. And when you reduce them, you justify your distance. And when distance becomes normal, indifference becomes moralized. This is how entire systems of injustice sustain themselves without explicit hatred, not through violence alone, but through failure of imagination. Consider the symbolic figure of the isolated individual, not cruel, not overtly malicious, but enclosed, living within a narrow circle of personal concern. This figure does not wake up intending harm, but harm follows from their blindness, because they never cross the boundary of self. Through this figure, we see the quiet dangers Smith identified. The absence of sympathy is not loud. It does not always announce itself. It operates silently, through omission, through what we fail to feel, through what we refuse to see. And so the question sharpens. Are you truly moral if your imagination never leaves your own experience? This is where the deeper psychological layer unfolds. At the core of human resistance to sympathy lies fear. Not fear of others, but fear of losing control over one's own narrative. To imagine another fully is to admit that your perspective is not absolute. It is to accept that your pain is not unique, that your desires are not central, that your interpretation of events is partial. This threatens the ego, and the ego resists. It prefers clarity over complexity, certainty over ambiguity, judgment over understanding, because judgment preserves distance, and distance preserves identity. Sympathy does the opposite. It dissolves boundaries. It forces proximity. It destabilizes identity. That is why it is rare, and that is why it is essential. Smith does not offer comfort here. He does not say humans are naturally good because they can feel for others. He says humans have the capacity, but capacity is not action, and potential is not guarantee. The moral life begins not with what you feel, but with what you are willing to imagine. And that willingness is a choice. Now everything converges. Human beings are not moral because they follow rules. They are moral when they transcend their immediate perspective. Sympathy is not an accessory to ethics. It is its foundation. Without it, judgment becomes arbitrary. With it, judgment becomes accountable. The individual, the society, the era, all are shaped by how far this imagination extends. And in a world that grows more connected, yet more fragmented, the demand becomes sharper, not weaker. You cannot outsource sympathy. You cannot automate it. You cannot replace it with data or ideology. You either do the work or you live in distortion. The text you provided reveals this structure clearly, not as theory alone, but as a diagnosis of the human condition, a condition that has not changed, only disguised itself in more sophisticated forms. And so we arrive at the final synthesis. Morality is not a system imposed from above. It is a discipline cultivated within, a discipline of imagination, a discipline of self-correction, a discipline of confronting the limits of one's own perspective. Without it, there is no justice, only preference. Without it, there is no understanding, only projection. Without it, there is no humanity, only isolated selves orbiting their own illusions. And at that moment, the truth becomes unavoidable. You are not limited by what you feel. You are limited by what you refuse to imagine. Chapter 2: The Silent Judge Within Every Human Being. Human beings are never alone with their actions. Even in silence, even in isolation, there is always a witness inside. Not a passive observer, but a relentless judge that measures, questions, and confronts every impulse. What we call conscience is not a feeling, it is a tribunal. Before psychology named the inner critic, before modern ethics attempted to formalize moral reasoning, Adam Smith had already uncovered this internal structure. When the world still believed that morality came from external authority or divine command, he revealed something more unsettling. Judgment does not begin outside, it begins within. And it does not wait for society, it anticipates it. This inner figure, what Smith calls the impartial spectator, is not born fully formed, it is constructed. It emerges from our repeated attempts to see ourselves as others would see us, not as we wish to be seen, but as we actually appear. And this is where the fracture begins. You do not judge yourself directly, you split. One part acts, another part watches, and the watching part is never fully on your side. This division is the foundation of moral life. At first glance, it may seem that human beings simply react. They feel anger, desire, pride, shame. They act accordingly. But Smith strips this illusion away. He shows that between feeling and action, there is interruption, a pause, a silent question. How would this look to someone else? And more dangerously, would they approve? This is not social conformity, it is internalized scrutiny. The impartial spectator does not merely mirror society, it refines it. It is built from experience, from observation, from countless acts of imagining how others perceive us. Over time, it becomes less dependent on actual people and more autonomous. It becomes a standard that can oppose even the crowd. This is the paradox. True moral judgment does not come from cold detachment. It comes from cultivated sympathy. The more deeply you learn to imagine others, the more demanding your internal judge becomes. Not softer, not weaker, more precise. Fairness is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling disciplined by perspective. Most people misunderstand this. They believe that to be fair is to suppress emotion, to become neutral, detached. But neutrality without imagination is blindness. It does not correct bias. It hides it. The impartial spectator is not cold. It is balanced. It does not erase feeling, it repositions it. And here, the first core tension emerges. Your immediate self wants justification. It wants to defend its impulses, to rationalize its actions, to protect its identity. But the inner spectator demands something else. It demands distance. It demands that you step outside your own urgency and look back at yourself as if you were another. Can you do that honestly? Or do you secretly manipulate this inner voice to agree with you? This is where most people fail. They believe they possess a conscience, but what they actually have is a compliant narrator, a voice that explains, excuses, softens, not a judge, but a lawyer. Smith exposes this distortion. The impartial spectator is not meant to comfort you. It is meant to confront you. It does not ask how you feel about your actions. It asks whether your actions withstand the scrutiny of a wider perspective. And that perspective is not fixed. It evolves. It sharpens. It becomes more demanding as your capacity for sympathy deepens. The more you understand others, the less tolerant you become of your own moral shortcuts. This is not moral perfection. It is moral tension. You are never fully aligned with yourself. And that is the point. Because without this tension, there is no self-correction. Without this internal dialogue, there is no growth. A person who never questions themselves does not achieve clarity. They achieve stagnation. Now bring this into the present. In a world of constant exposure, constant performance, constant validation, the inner spectator is under threat. Not because it disappears, but because it is drowned out. External voices become louder. Approval becomes immediate. Judgment becomes superficial. We begin to outsource conscience. We measure ourselves not by an internal standard, but by visible reactions, likes, comments, recognition. And slowly, the impartial spectator is replaced by an audience. But an audience is unstable. It shifts. It contradicts itself. It rewards inconsistency. The result is fragmentation. You no longer ask what is right. You ask what is accepted. You no longer confront yourself. You curate yourself. And in doing so, you weaken the very mechanism that makes moral life possible. The modern individual is not less judged. They are judged more. But the judgment lacks depth. It lacks continuity. It lacks the disciplined sympathy that Smith describes. And so it fails to produce true accountability. This is why anxiety rises while moral clarity declines. Because when judgment comes only from outside, it never settles. It never integrates. It never becomes part of you. It remains noise. The impartial spectator, in contrast, is silent, consistent, inescapable. It does not shout. It waits. And when you finally listen, it does not negotiate. At the psychological core, this inner figure represents something deeper than social awareness. It represents the human capacity to transcend immediate identity, to become both subject and object, to act and to observe the act simultaneously. This duality is not comfortable. It means you can never fully merge with your desires. You can never completely justify yourself. There's always a remainder, a question that lingers, a doubt that resists closure. Why did you do that? And more importantly, would you accept it if someone else did the same? This is the question that breaks illusion because it forces symmetry. It forces you to apply to yourself the same standard you apply to others. And here, inconsistency is exposed. We are harsh toward others and lenient toward ourselves, or the opposite, severe with ourselves and forgiving toward others. In both cases, imbalance persists. The impartial spectator seeks equilibrium, not perfection, not purity, but alignment. And alignment requires honesty. Consider the figure of a person standing alone after an action has been taken. No witnesses, no consequences yet, just silence. In that silence, something emerges, not fear, not pride, but evaluation. Through this figure, we see the essence of Smith's insight. Morality is not enforced only through systems. It is sustained through internal observation, through the ability to judge oneself as if one were not oneself. This ability is fragile. It can be dulled, ignored, manipulated, but it cannot be completely erased, because as long as you can imagine another perspective, you cannot fully escape judgment. And this leads to the deeper existential layer. The presence of the impartial spectator means that freedom is never absolute. You are free to act, but not free from evaluation. You carry your judge with you, and that judge does not sleep. This is not oppression, it is structure. Without it, freedom collapses into chaos. With it, freedom becomes accountable. But here lies the final tension. Do you listen, or do you silence it? Every time you ignore that inner voice, it weakens, not permanently, but progressively. And over time, something shifts. Actions become easier to justify. Boundaries become easier to cross. And eventually, you no longer feel the weight of your own decisions. This is not liberation. It is erosion. The text you provided makes this clear. Conscience is not a fixed entity. It is a practice, a continuous act of internal dialogue, a negotiation between who you are and who you could be under a more impartial gaze. And so everything converges again. Human beings are not moral because they follow external rules. They are moral because they develop an internal standard that can challenge their own impulses. The impartial spectator is not an abstract idea. It is the condition for self-respect. Without it, there is no integrity, only performance. Without it, there is no justice, only reaction. Without it, there is no self, only impulse dressed as identity. And in the end, the most dangerous lie is not that others misjudge you. It is that you stop judging yourself. Chapter 3, The Limits of Sympathy and the Distortion of the Human Heart. Human beings do not feel equally. What we call compassion is selective, unstable, and deeply biased. It does not extend naturally to all suffering. It bends toward what is near, what is visible, what resembles us, and everything outside that radius fades into abstraction. Before moral philosophy attempted to universalize ethics, before global awareness made distant suffering visible, Adam Smith had already exposed this fracture. When the world still believed that human sympathy could serve as a reliable moral guide, he revealed its limits, not as a flaw to be ignored, but as a condition to be confronted. Sympathy is not infinite. It is constrained by distance. The closer something is to you, the more real it feels. The more distant it is, the more it dissolves into concept. This is not cruelty, it is structure. The human mind is not designed to hold the full weight of all suffering. It prioritizes, it filters, it reduces. And in that reduction, morality begins to warp. You can hear about a tragedy across the world and feel a brief reaction, a moment of discomfort, a flicker of concern. But it fades quickly. Meanwhile, a minor inconvenience in your own life can dominate your entire emotional landscape. This is not because your problem is greater. It is because it is closer. So the question cuts deeper. If your moral response depends on proximity, can you ever claim to be just? Smith forces us into this discomfort. He does not accuse, he reveals. He shows that the human heart is not a neutral instrument. It is biased toward itself, toward what it can immediately grasp, toward what it can imagine without effort, and everything else becomes faint. This creates the first distortion. We overestimate the importance of what is near and underestimate the weight of what is far. Not because we choose to, but because we feel more intensely where we stand. And intensity masquerades as importance. This is the illusion. Feeling strongly does not mean something matters more. It only means it is closer to you. Most people never question this. They trust their emotional responses as indicators of value. If something hurts deeply, it must be significant. If something barely registers, it must be minor. But this logic collapses under scrutiny. A distant catastrophe may carry immense human costs, yet evoke little emotional reaction. A personal inconvenience may carry little objective weight, yet feel overwhelming. If morality follows feeling alone, it becomes inconsistent. And inconsistency is the beginning of injustice. Smith does not suggest eliminating feeling. That would be impossible. Instead, he demands correction, a deliberate effort to counterbalance the natural bias of sympathy, to use reflection where instinct fails. This is where mature morality begins, not in feeling more, but in questioning what you feel. Why does this affect me so strongly? Why does that barely touch me? What am I ignoring simply because it is not in front of me? These questions are not comfortable. They expose a truth most people avoid. You do not care equally, and left unchecked, you never will. The second distortion emerges from familiarity. We sympathize more with those who resemble us, those who share our language, our culture, our values, our identity. Similarity creates access. It makes imagination easier. We can project ourselves into their situation with less resistance. But difference creates distance. The more someone diverges from us, the harder it becomes to imagine their experience. Not because it is impossible, but because it demands more effort. And again, the mind avoids effort. So we reduce them. We simplify their reality. We misunderstand their motives. We judge them quickly, not out of deliberate malice, but out of cognitive economy. It is easier to dismiss than to reconstruct. And here, morality fractures again, because justice requires that we evaluate others fairly, not conveniently, but convenience dominates. We excuse those close to us. We condemn those far from us. We forgive what we understand and reject what we do not. This pattern repeats across individuals, groups, societies, and it feels natural. That is precisely why it is dangerous. Now bring this into the present. In the era of 2025, distance has collapsed technologically, but expanded psychologically. We can see everything, yet we feel selectively. We are exposed to countless lives, yet we engage with only a few. The scale of awareness has increased, but the depth of sympathy has not followed. If anything, it has thinned. Because the more suffering we encounter without fully processing it, the more we protect ourselves by disengaging, not consciously, but gradually. The mind numbs itself to preserve stability. This is not apathy as a choice, it is apathy as adaptation. And yet, the moral consequence remains. When too much becomes visible, everything risks becoming trivial. We scroll past tragedy. We consume it as information. We react briefly, then move on. Not because we are inherently indifferent, but because we are overwhelmed. And overwhelmed sympathy transforms into selective attention. We choose what to feel, and what we do not choose fades. This is where Smith's insight becomes more relevant, not less. He anticipated that sympathy alone cannot sustain morality, because sympathy is unstable. It fluctuates with distance, familiarity, and cognitive capacity. So what must intervene? Reflection. The ability to step back from your immediate feelings and evaluate them. Not to suppress them, but to recalibrate them. To recognize that your emotional map of the world is distorted, and that correction requires effort. This is the third movement. Mature morality is not natural. It is constructed. It requires that you actively extend your concern beyond what feels immediate, that you question your preferences, that you resist the pull of proximity, that you recognize the limits of your own heart. This is not intuitive. It is discipline. And most people avoid it because it demands something uncomfortable. It demands that you admit your empathy is insufficient, that your natural responses are not enough, that you must go beyond yourself to reach something closer to fairness. This threatens identity. We like to see ourselves as caring, as good, as responsive. But when confronted with the limits of our sympathy, this image cracks. We are forced to see the gaps, the inconsistencies, the selective blindness, and many turn away. They defend their feelings instead of examining them. They justify their focus instead of expanding it. They remain within the comfort of partial concern. But partial concern cannot produce full justice. Now the psychological depth reveals itself. At the core of selective sympathy lies a fundamental tension. The human being wants to preserve emotional energy, to focus on what is manageable, to avoid the burden of too much awareness. But at the same time, the human being wants to see themselves as moral. These two desires conflict. To maintain both, the mind constructs a compromise. It narrows the field of concern and elevates the importance of what remains. It convinces itself that what it feels is enough. This is self-deception, not intentional, but functional. And it allows the individual to continue without confronting the full scope of moral responsibility. But the cost is fragmentation. You become consistent within your narrow circle, but inconsistent across the broader human field. You are fair to some, indifferent to others, compassionate in one context, detached in another. And yet, you call this coherence. Smith dismantles this illusion. He shows that morality requires expansion beyond instinct, that true ethical development is not about feeling more intensely, but about feeling more accurately. And accuracy requires correction. Consider the figure of a person who reacts strongly to personal insult, but remains unmoved by large-scale suffering. Through this figure, we see the imbalance clearly. The scale is inverted. The minor becomes major. The major becomes distant. This is not an exception. It is the rule. And unless challenged, it persists. So the demand becomes unavoidable. Will you allow your feelings to dictate your morality? Or will you reshape your feelings through reflection? This is the dividing line. Because once you recognize the limits of your sympathy, you cannot return to innocence. You cannot claim that what you feel is sufficient. You are confronted with a choice. Either remain within the comfort of partial awareness or engage in the difficult work of expansion. There is no neutral ground. The text you provided makes this tension explicit. Human beings are not naturally unjust, but they are naturally partial. And without intervention, partiality leads to distortion. Everything now converges into a single structure. Sympathy initiates morality, but it cannot complete it. It provides the first connection, but not the final judgment. For that, reflection must intervene. Correction must occur. The heart must be guided by thought. Otherwise, morality becomes geography. It depends on where you stand. It depends on who you resemble. It depends on what you happen to see. And that is not morality. That is accident. So the final truth emerges with clarity. You do not fail morally because you lack feeling. You fail because you trust your feelings without question. And in that moment, you are no longer responding to the world as it is. You are responding only to the narrow boundaries of your own perception. And that is where justice begins to disappear. Chapter 4. Self-interest is not selfishness. Human beings do not act without self-interest. Every action, no matter how noble it appears, is rooted in some form of personal concern. The desire for survival, recognition, dignity, or inner coherence always stands behind what we do. What we call pure altruism is often a misunderstanding of more complex motives. And yet, to conclude from this that humans are merely selfish is a profound error. Before modern economics reduced human behavior to utility and gain, before cynicism turned self-interest into a synonym for greed, Adam Smith had already drawn a sharper line. When the world oscillated between idealizing virtue and condemning desire, he revealed a deeper structure. Self-interest is not the enemy of morality. It is one of its conditions. The problem is not that humans pursue their own benefit. The problem is how they understand that benefit. At the most basic level, self-interest appears simple. You act to gain something: wealth, security, advantage. But Smith strips away this simplicity. He shows that human motivation is layered. You do not only want material gain. You want to be seen in a certain way. You want approval. You want to feel worthy in your own eyes. This is where the concept fractures. If self-interest includes the desire for respect, then your actions are never purely isolated. They are always oriented toward a social field. You care not only about what you get, but about how you are perceived while getting it. And this changes everything. Because now self-interest is no longer blind appetite. It becomes entangled with reputation, honor, and self-respect. You do not simply pursue gain. You pursue a version of yourself that can live with that gain. This introduces tension. You could take more than what is fair. You could exploit. You could deceive. These actions may serve immediate interest, but they damage something else. You're standing in the eyes of others. And more importantly, you're standing in the eyes of your own internal judge. So the question emerges with force. What is the point of gaining everything if you cannot respect the one who gains it? Here, Smith's insight becomes precise. Human beings are not satisfied by possession alone. They seek alignment between what they have and what they believe they deserve, between what they achieve and how they achieve it. This is the first correction to the crude idea of selfishness. Self-interest is not just about acquisition. It is about justification. And justification requires a framework. You want to see yourself as legitimate, as deserving, as someone whose success is not merely effective, but acceptable. This is where morality enters not as an external constraint, but as an internal requirement. Because without it, success feels hollow. Now the misunderstanding becomes clear. People assume that to be moral, one must suppress self-interest, deny it, reject it. But this creates distortion. Suppressed desire does not disappear. It returns in disguised forms. It manipulates behavior from beneath awareness. Smith does not advocate suppression. He advocates integration. Self-interest must be placed within a structure that aligns it with broader social order. Not eliminated, but shaped. Not denied, but disciplined. Because when self-interest operates without limits, it becomes destructive. But when it is properly framed, it becomes productive. This is the second movement. Your interest is never purely yours. It intersects with others. Every action you take enters a network of consequences. You depend on others to recognize your value, to engage with you, to trust you. Without this network, your self-interest cannot function effectively. So even from a purely strategic standpoint, cooperation becomes necessary. But Smith goes further. He shows that this is not only about strategy, it is about identity. You do not want to be seen as someone who gains at any cost, because that image isolates you. It undermines your claim to respect. It places you outside the moral community, and human beings resist that exclusion. So they adjust, not always consciously, but persistently. They balance their pursuit of advantage with the need to remain acceptable. They moderate behavior. They justify decisions. They seek approval. This is not hypocrisy. It is structure. Now bring this into the present. In the world of 2025, self-interest has been amplified and simplified at the same time. Amplified through systems that reward visibility, accumulation, and competition. Simplified through narratives that reduce success to outcome alone. Win, gain, advance. But something is missing. The question of how. Modern culture often celebrates results without interrogating the path. It elevates achievement while ignoring the process. And in doing so, it distorts self-interest into something narrower than it truly is. Because when you remove the dimension of dignity, self-interest collapses into raw appetite. And raw appetite is unstable. It leads to short-term gains and long-term erosion of trust, of relationships, of internal coherence. You may succeed outwardly, but inwardly something fractures, because the internal spectator does not disappear. It observes, it records, it evaluates. And if your actions cannot withstand that evaluation, you carry a silent conflict. This is the third movement. Self-interest without moral alignment produces inner division. You achieve, but you cannot fully own your achievement. You gain, but you question its legitimacy. You advance, but you feel the instability beneath your position. This is not external punishment. It is internal dissonance. And no amount of external success can fully silence it. So the deeper question must be asked: what kind of self is your interest serving? Is it a self that seeks only advantage, or a self that demands coherence? Is it a self that accumulates, or a self that can stand under scrutiny? Because these are not the same. Smith insists that self-interest must be understood in its full complexity. It is not merely about what you want. It is about what you can live with. It is about what version of yourself you are constructing through your actions. And this construction is continuous. Every decision shapes it. Every compromise alters it. Every justification reinforces it. Over time, a pattern emerges. A character forms. Not through abstract ideals, but through repeated alignment or misalignment between desire and judgment. Consider the figure of a person who achieves great success, but loses the ability to respect themselves. Outwardly powerful, inwardly unstable. Through this figure, the illusion is exposed. Success without moral grounding does not produce fulfillment. It produces fragmentation. Because the self is not unified. It is split between what it has gained and how it has gained it. And that split does not disappear. Now the synthesis becomes unavoidable. Self-interest is not the opposite of morality. It is one of its driving forces. But it must be elevated, expanded, integrated into a broader framework where personal gain does not destroy social trust and where success does not undermine self-respect. This requires awareness. You must see beyond immediate reward. You must consider long-term coherence. You must evaluate not only outcomes, but processes. Not only benefits, but costs. And most importantly, you must confront yourself. Because no external system can fully regulate this. Laws can restrict behavior, norms can guide it, but the final alignment occurs within, between your desire and your judgment, between your ambition and your conscience. The text you provided points directly to this balance. Self-interest is inevitable, but selfishness is not. The difference lies in structure, in whether your pursuit of benefit recognizes the existence of others, the demands of fairness, and the necessity of internal justification. Everything converges into a single truth. You do not escape self-interest. You define it. You choose whether it remains narrow and destructive or becomes expansive and integrated. You choose whether your success isolates you or connects you. You choose whether your gains strengthen your identity or fracture it. And in the end, the most dangerous illusion is not that you pursue your own benefit. It is that you believe any benefit is worth pursuing. Chapter 5: The Invisible Order that Emerges Without Intention. Human beings do not fully control the consequences of their actions. What they intend and what actually unfolds are rarely the same. And yet, from this gap between intention and outcome, entire systems of order arise. Not designed, not commanded, but formed through countless interactions that no single mind can oversee. Before complexity theory, Before modern economics attempted to model emergent systems, Adam Smith had already seen this hidden structure. When the world still believed that order required central direction, he revealed a more unsettling truth. There are forces at work within human interaction that produce coherence without a planner. Not because humans are perfectly rational, but because their limitations interact in patterned ways. This is the first rupture. Order does not always come from control. It often emerges from constraint. Each individual acts from a limited perspective, driven by self-interest, shaped by partial knowledge, bounded by circumstance. No one sees the whole. No one intends the total outcome. And yet, when these fragmented actions intersect, something larger begins to take form. A pattern appears, not imposed, but generated. Smith names this phenomenon through what later becomes known as the invisible hand. But the phrase itself is less important than the mechanism it points to. Individuals pursue their own goals, but in doing so, they unintentionally contribute to a broader structure that no one explicitly designed. This is not harmony by intention. It is coordination by consequence. And here the misunderstanding begins. Many assume that this invisible order guarantees good outcomes, that if individuals simply follow their interests, the system will naturally produce balance. But Smith does not make this naive claim. He reveals the possibility of order, not its inevitability. Because the same mechanism that produces coordination can also produce distortion. The outcome depends on the conditions within which these interactions occur. This is the second movement. Spontaneous order is not inherently moral. It reflects the structure that contains it. If the underlying rules are fair, if trust exists, if institutions support accountability, then individual actions can align in ways that generate stability and growth. But if those conditions are corrupted, the same decentralized interactions can amplify inequality, exploitation, and imbalance. The invisible hand does not judge, it organizes. And what it organizes depends on what it is given. So the question becomes sharper. What kind of order are your actions contributing to, even when you are not aware of it? Because you are always participating in a system larger than yourself. You do not act in isolation. Every decision enters a network. Every choice affects others, directly or indirectly. And while you may not see the full chain of consequences, it continues to unfold. This is where human limitation becomes both a strength and a danger. No one can control the whole system. That is precisely why centralized control fails. It lacks the information, the adaptability, the responsiveness that decentralized interaction provides. But at the same time, no individual can fully predict the outcomes of their actions within that system. So uncertainty remains, and with it, responsibility. Most people avoid this complexity. They prefer simple narratives. Either everything is controlled or everything is free. Either order is imposed or it is natural. But Smith rejects this binary. He shows that reality operates in between. Order emerges, but it must be sustained by conditions that are themselves fragile. Now bring this into the present. In the world of 2025, Systems have expanded beyond anything Smith could have directly observed. Global markets, digital networks, algorithmic coordination. The scale has multiplied, the speed has intensified, but the underlying principle remains unchanged. Individual actions aggregate, unintended consequences accumulate, patterns emerge, and yet the illusion of control persists. People believe they can design outcomes precisely, that with enough data, enough optimization, enough intervention, the system can be fully directed. But this belief ignores the fundamental insight. Complexity resists total control. It adapts. It evolves. It produces outcomes that exceed intention. This is not failure. It is structure. And misunderstanding this structure leads to two opposite errors. The first is overconfidence, the belief that systems can be engineered to perfection, that unintended consequences can be eliminated, that human interaction can be fully predicted. This leads to rigid control, to over-intervention, to the suppression of organic adaptation. The second is negligence, the belief that no intervention is needed, that the system will correct itself regardless of conditions, that individual pursuit of interest is sufficient to produce good outcomes. This leads to neglect, to imbalance, to the erosion of fairness. Both errors ignore the same truth. Order is emergent, but not self-sufficient. It requires a framework. This is the third movement. Spontaneous coordination depends on underlying stability. Without trust, interactions become defensive. Without fairness, they become exploitative. Without accountability, they become destructive. The invisible hand cannot compensate for broken foundations. It amplifies what exists. If the base is stable, it stabilizes further. If the base is corrupt, it accelerates corruption. This is why Smith never separates economic processes from moral and institutional contexts. He understands that markets are not isolated mechanisms. They are embedded within societies, within norms, within systems of justice. And when those systems weaken, the emergent order reflects that weakness. Now the psychological dimension emerges. Human beings prefer to see themselves as intentional agents, as authors of their actions. But in complex systems, much of what we contribute lies beyond our awareness. We act for one reason, but produce effects for another. We aim for personal benefit, but influence collective outcomes. This creates a gap between intention and responsibility, and most people retreat from this gap. They claim innocence based on intention. They say, "I did not mean for this to happen." But the system does not operate on intention alone. It operates on interaction, on accumulation, on consequence. So the deeper question becomes unavoidable. Are you responsible only for what you intend, or also for what you contribute? This is not a question with easy answers, because full awareness is impossible. You cannot trace every consequence of your actions. You cannot predict every outcome. But this does not eliminate responsibility. It transforms it. You are responsible for the structure you support, for the patterns you reinforce, for the conditions you accept or challenge. Even if you do not see the full outcome, consider the figure of an individual who participates in a system that produces harm, not through direct intention, but through cumulative effect. Through this figure, we see the core tension. The individual does not act with malice, yet contributes to a structure that generates imbalance. This is not an anomaly, it is the norm, and it reveals the limits of individual morality when disconnected from systemic awareness. Smith does not resolve this tension, he exposes it. He shows that human action always operates within a network of consequences that exceed individual control. But he also insists that this does not absolve us. It demands vigilance, not total control, but continuous evaluation. Not perfect prediction, but awareness of patterns. This is where the synthesis becomes clear. Human beings create order without intending it, but they also sustain or distort that order through their repeated actions. The invisible hand is not a guarantee. It is a process, one that reflects the moral and institutional conditions in which it operates. You cannot escape participation. You are already part of the system. Your actions, however small, enter the network. They influence outcomes beyond your immediate perception. They contribute to patterns that shape the lives of others. And this is where the final truth emerges. You do not need to intend harm to be part of it. You only need to act without awareness of the structure you sustain. The text you provided makes this unavoidable. Social order is not simply designed, it emerges. But its quality depends on the conditions we maintain and the actions we repeat. Everything converges into a single point. You are not the architect of the whole, but you are never outside it. And in that realization, one illusion collapses completely. The illusion that what you do ends with you, because it never does. Chapter 6, The Price of Efficiency and the Narrowing of the Human Being. Human beings do not only build systems, they are shaped by the systems they build. Every structure designed for efficiency eventually turns back on its creators and reshapes their minds, their habits, and their capacity to think. What increases productivity can simultaneously diminish the individual. Before industrial society fully revealed its consequences, before modern life fragmented attention and identity into specialized functions, Adam Smith had already seen the hidden cost. When the world began to celebrate productivity as progress, he exposed a quieter danger. Division of labor does not only multiply output, it divides the human being. This is the first fracture. Efficiency does not come without loss. At its core, division of labor appears undeniably beneficial. By breaking complex tasks into smaller parts, each individual can focus, repeat, refine. Productivity increases, output expands, wealth grows. Society becomes materially richer. This is the visible gain. But Smith does not stop at what is visible. He asks what happens to the person who performs only a fragment of a whole. What happens to a mind that repeats the same motion, the same decision, the same narrow function day after day? What happens to a consciousness that no longer needs to think broadly, but only precisely within a confined domain? The answer is not abstract. The mind contracts. When action becomes repetitive, thought becomes shallow. When work requires only a limited range of skills, the rest of the individual begins to atrophy. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, persistently. This is the second movement. Specialization increases competence in one area while reducing capacity in others. You become sharper but narrower. You gain precision but lose scope. And over time, this trade becomes invisible because the gain is rewarded. It is recognized. It produces measurable results, while the loss remains internal, silent, unnoticed, until it has already taken root. Most people never question this exchange. They see success, they see efficiency, they see progress, but they do not ask what kind of human being this progress is producing. Smith forces this question into the open. A society can become wealthier while its individuals become intellectually diminished, not because they lack intelligence, but because their daily structure does not require its full use. The system does not demand breadth, it rewards focus, and what is not used begins to fade. This is not failure, it is adaptation. The human mind adapts to what it repeatedly does. If it is trained to operate within narrow parameters, it becomes optimized for that range. But optimization comes with exclusion. The more refined one capacity becomes, the more others are neglected, and this neglect accumulates. Now, the deeper misunderstanding emerges. People assume that efficiency leads naturally to development, that becoming more productive also means becoming more complete. But Smith dismantles this illusion. Productivity is not the same as growth. It is not the same as maturity. It is not the same as fulfillment. You can produce more and become less. This is the hidden cost. Now bring this into the present. In the world of 2025, division of labor has extended beyond physical tasks into cognitive and digital realms. Work is fragmented into roles, functions, micro-specializations. Attention is divided. Identity is tied to specific outputs. You are no longer simply a worker. You are a function, defined by what you produce, measured by how efficiently you produce it, evaluated by how well you fit into a system that requires consistency more than depth. And the system rewards this. It encourages repetition. It values predictability. It prioritizes measurable output over internal development. And slowly, without noticing, individuals begin to align themselves with these expectations. They reduce themselves, not out of coercion, but out of adaptation. This is a third movement. The system does not force you to narrow, it conditions you to choose it. Because narrowing produces immediate reward. It leads to recognition, to stability, to advancement. While expansion requires effort, it demands time that does not directly translate into output. It resists easy measurement. So most people choose the path that is reinforced. And in doing so, they participate in their own reduction. This is where the existential dimension emerges. At the core of this process lies a tension between being and functioning, between the full range of human potential and the limited demands of a role. The more you identify with your function, the more you risk losing connection with the rest of yourself. You become what you do, and nothing beyond it. This is efficient, but it is incomplete, because a human being is not a single capacity, not a single skill, not a single role. The richness of human life lies in its multiplicity, in the ability to think broadly, to reflect, to imagine, to judge, to feel across different dimensions. When this multiplicity is reduced, something essential is lost. Not externally, but internally. You may not notice it immediately. You may feel productive, effective, even successful. But beneath that, a narrowing occurs. Your range of thought contracts. Your curiosity diminishes. Your ability to engage with complexity weakens. And over time, this becomes your normal. You no longer feel the absence because you have adapted to it. This is the danger. Not that division of labor exists, but that its cost becomes invisible. Smith does not argue against specialization. He recognizes its necessity, its power, its contribution to societal development. But he insists on something crucial. A society that values efficiency must also protect the development of the individual, because without that protection, the very system that generates wealth begins to erode the human capacity that sustains it. This is not a contradiction, it is a balance. Economic strength and human depth must coexist. If one expands while the other contracts, the system becomes unstable. It produces output but lacks resilience. It generates wealth but weakens judgment. It advances materially but regresses internally. Now consider the symbolic figure of the highly specialized individual, exceptionally skilled in one domain, efficient, productive, recognized, but unable to step outside that domain, unable to think broadly, unable to engage with complexity beyond their function. Through this figure, the paradox becomes visible. Mastery in one area can coexist with limitation in others. And if the system rewards only that mastery, the limitation deepens. This is not an individual failure. It is a structural outcome, and it demands a response. Smith points toward education as a counterbalance, not education as technical training, but as expansion, as a way to maintain the breadth of the human mind, to ensure that individuals are not reduced entirely to their economic function. Because without this, the consequences extend beyond the individual. A society of narrow minds cannot sustain a complex system. It lacks the capacity to reflect, to adapt, to correct itself. It becomes efficient in the short term, but fragile in the long term. It produces output, but cannot question the conditions under which that output is produced. And without questioning, distortion persists. Now everything converges. Division of labor increases productivity, but it also risks reducing the individual. Efficiency generates wealth, but it can diminish depth. Progress expands externally, but can contract internally. This is not an argument against progress. It is a demand for awareness. You must ask not only what you are producing, but what you are becoming in the process, because the two are not independent. Every repetition shapes you. Every role defines you. Every system you participate in leaves an imprint on your mind. The text you provided reveals this tension with clarity. Economic development is not neutral. It transforms human beings. And unless this transformation is balanced, it leads to a subtle but profound loss. So the final truth emerges with force. You are not only the creator of value, you are also its consequence. And in the pursuit of doing more, the question becomes unavoidable. What are you losing while you become efficient? Chapter 7. Justice and kindness are not the same. Human beings confuse goodness with obligation. They believe that to be moral is to be kind in every situation, to give, to forgive, to extend warmth without limit. But this belief collapses under pressure because morality does not begin with generosity. It begins with restraint, with boundaries, with what must never be violated. Before modern societies blurred the line between legal duty and moral aspiration, before the language of compassion was stretched to cover all forms of behavior, Adam Smith had already drawn a sharp distinction. When the world still tried to ground ethics in universal benevolence, he revealed a harder truth. Justice and kindness are not equal forces. They do not operate on the same level, and confusing them leads to moral chaos. Justice is mandatory. Kindness is voluntary. This is the first rupture. Justice defines the minimum conditions under which human beings can coexist. It sets limits. It prohibits harm. It establishes what must not be done. You cannot steal. You cannot injure. You cannot violate another's basic standing. These are not suggestions. They are constraints, and society enforces them. Kindness operates differently. It cannot be demanded in the same way. You cannot force someone to be generous. You cannot compel genuine care. You can punish harm, but you cannot legislate compassion. The moment kindness becomes obligation, it loses its nature. It becomes performance, compliance, not virtue. This is where confusion begins. People expect others to be kind as if it were a duty. They demand generosity, forgiveness, empathy, as if these were enforceable rights. But Smith exposes the danger. When kindness is treated as obligation, it distorts both justice and morality. Because now, failure to be generous is treated as wrongdoing. And this is false. Not helping is not the same as harming. Refusing to give is not the same as taking. These distinctions matter. Without them, the moral structure collapses. This is the second movement. Justice protects. Kindness elevates. Justice creates the conditions for stability. It prevents destruction. It ensures that individuals can exist without fear of violation. It is the foundation. Without it, nothing else holds. Society disintegrates into conflict. Kindness, on the other hand, enhances what already exists. It builds trust. It deepens relationships. It creates meaning beyond mere survival. But it depends on freedom. It must be chosen, otherwise it becomes hollow. Smith insists on this hierarchy. A society can function with justice alone, though it may be cold, but it cannot function with kindness alone if justice is absent, because kindness cannot compensate for injustice. It cannot replace structure. It cannot repair systemic harm when basic rules are violated. And yet, people reverse this. They praise kindness while neglecting justice. They celebrate generosity while tolerating unfairness. They focus on acts of giving while ignoring acts of harm. And in doing so, they create a distorted moral landscape where appearances matter more than foundations. Now bring this into the present. In the world of 2025, this confusion has intensified. Public discourse elevates kindness as the highest virtue. Empathy is demanded. Compassion is expected, and those who fail to display it are judged harshly. But something deeper is often ignored. Are the structures just? Are the rules fair? Are the boundaries respected? Because without these, kindness becomes a mask. People can appear generous while benefiting from unjust systems. They can perform empathy while avoiding responsibility. They can give selectively while ignoring the conditions that create need in the first place. This is not morality, it is compensation. And compensation does not resolve injustice, it obscures it. This is the third movement. Justice requires enforcement. Kindness resists coercion. You can build institutions to uphold justice, laws, systems, consequences. These create accountability. They establish clear expectations. They define what is unacceptable. But kindness cannot be institutionalized in the same way. The moment it is enforced, it loses authenticity. It becomes obligation without sincerity, action without inner alignment. And over time, this erodes trust rather than building it. Because people sense the difference. They can tell when kindness is genuine and when it is performed under pressure. So the question emerges with force. Do you want a society where people are forced to appear good, or one where they are prevented from doing harm? These are not the same. Smith chooses clarity. Prevent harm first. Encourage good, but do not confuse it with duty. Now the psychological depth unfolds. At the core of this confusion lies a human desire for approval. People want to be seen as good, as kind, as generous. And because kindness is visible, it becomes a tool for recognition, a way to signal virtue. Justice, in contrast, is less visible. Not harming others does not attract attention. Respecting boundaries does not generate praise. It is silent, expected, often unnoticed. So individuals gravitate toward what is seen. They prioritize acts that display goodness rather than maintaining conditions that ensure fairness. They focus on being perceived as kind rather than being structurally just. This creates a subtle distortion. Morality shifts from substance to appearance, and once that shift occurs, the internal standard weakens. The impartial spectator is replaced by the external audience. Actions are evaluated not by their alignment with principle, but by their visibility. This is dangerous because it allows injustice to persist beneath the surface of kindness. People may give, support, express concern, while still participating in systems that produce harm. And because their visible actions are positive, the underlying issues remain unchallenged. This is how moral blindness sustains itself, not through absence of care, but through misdirected care. Now consider the symbolic figure of a person who is outwardly generous, but inwardly indifferent to fairness. They help when it is visible. They give when it is recognized, but they ignore structural harm. They avoid difficult questions. They maintain comfort. Through this figure, the illusion becomes clear. Kindness without justice is unstable. It lacks foundation, and eventually it collapses. Because when harm accumulates, no amount of voluntary good can compensate for systemic violation. The imbalance grows, trust erodes, and the surface fractures. Smith does not reject kindness. He elevates it by placing it in its proper position, as something beyond obligation, as something that enriches life when freely chosen, but never as a substitute for justice. This is the synthesis. Justice defines the boundary. Kindness fills the space within it. One is required, the other is offered, and confusing them leads to moral distortion. You cannot demand kindness as a right. You can demand justice. You cannot punish someone for failing to be generous. You must punish them for causing harm. These distinctions are not technical. They are fundamental, because without them, society loses clarity. It begins to expect what cannot be enforced and neglect what must be protected. The text you provided reveals this boundary with precision. There are actions that must be prevented and actions that should be encouraged, and collapsing them into one category destroys both. Everything now converges into a single truth. A moral society is not one where everyone is kind. It is one where no one is allowed to be unjust. Kindness can elevate that society, but it cannot replace its foundation. And in the end, the most dangerous mistake is not the absence of goodness. It is the tolerance of injustice disguised as goodness. Chapter 8. Wealth corrupts, not by force, but by distortion of value. Wealth does not destroy the human soul directly. It distorts it. It shifts the scale by which a person measures worth until what is visible replaces what is real, and what is admired replaces what is good. The danger of wealth is not possession, it is misjudgment. Before modern capitalism elevated success into spectacle, before societies equated status with material accumulation, Adam Smith had already uncovered the deeper risk. When the world began to celebrate prosperity as unquestionable progress, he exposed a quieter collapse. A society can grow richer while losing its ability to recognize true value. This is the first rupture. Money is not the problem. Misplaced admiration is. At its origin, wealth serves a function. It facilitates exchange. It increases comfort. It expands possibility. It is a tool, neutral in itself, capable of supporting both good and harm. But human beings do not treat it as neutral. They attach meaning to it. They see wealth not only as resource, but as signal, a marker of success, of superiority, of worth. And once this shift occurs, the entire moral structure begins to tilt. Because now, what is admired is no longer virtue, it is possession. Smith observes this transformation with precision. People do not merely seek wealth for what it provides. They seek it for how it is perceived. They want to be seen as successful, respected, and elevated. And wealth becomes the most visible indicator of that elevation. This creates a powerful illusion. If wealth signals success, then those who possess it must deserve admiration, and those who lack it must be lacking in some essential way. This belief is rarely stated openly, but it operates beneath the surface of judgment, and it distorts everything. This is the second movement. We begin to admire what is easy to see and ignore what is difficult to measure. Virtue becomes invisible. Integrity has no immediate display. Wisdom does not announce itself. Moral discipline does not attract attention. These qualities require depth to recognize. They demand time, reflection, effort. Wealth, in contrast, is immediate. It presents itself clearly. It demands no interpretation. It is recognized instantly. And because it is visible, it becomes the default measure. This is not a rational choice. It is a cognitive shortcut. The human mind prefers what is clear over what is complex, what is visible over what is hidden. And so it elevates wealth as a proxy for value, not because it truly represents value, but because it is easier to perceive. And over time, this substitution becomes normalized. People no longer question it. They internalize it. They begin to judge themselves and others through this distorted lens. Success becomes synonymous with accumulation. Failure becomes associated with lack. And moral worth becomes entangled with economic status. This is where corruption begins, not through greed alone, but through confusion. Now, bring this into the present. In the world of 2025, this distortion has reached an intensified form. Visibility has multiplied. Wealth is no longer only possessed. It is displayed, amplified, broadcast. And with this amplification, admiration becomes more immediate, more widespread, more automatic. The gap between appearance and reality widens. People see wealth and assume competence. They see luxury and assume fulfillment. They see status and assume superiority. But these assumptions are projections. They are based on visibility, not substance. And yet they shape behavior. Individuals begin to pursue not only wealth, but the image of wealth. Not only success, but recognition of success. The goal shifts from being to appearing. And in that shift, something fundamental is lost. This is the third movement. Wealth alters not only how others see you, but how you see yourself. When external indicators dominate, internal evaluation weakens. You begin to rely on visible markers to define your worth. You measure yourself through comparison, through position, through accumulation. And slowly, the inner standard erodes. The impartial spectator, once a source of judgment, becomes quieter, because external validation is louder, more immediate, more rewarding. You no longer ask whether your life is coherent. You ask whether it is impressive. This is the psychological fracture. Your identity becomes dependent on recognition, and recognition is unstable. It fluctuates, it shifts, it depends on context, on audience, on trends. And because it is unstable, your sense of self becomes unstable as well. You gain, but you are not secure. You achieve, but you are not grounded. because the foundation is external. Smith anticipates this. He sees that excessive wealth can weaken the capacity for self-reflection, not because wealth eliminates intelligence, but because it reduces the need for it. When success is measured externally, the pressure to examine oneself diminishes, and without examination, distortion persists. Now the deeper existential layer emerges. At the core of this dynamic lies a human vulnerability, the desire to be admired, to be recognized, to be seen as significant. This desire is not inherently wrong. It is part of social existence. But when it attaches itself to wealth as the primary signal, it becomes misdirected. You begin to chase admiration instead of substance, and admiration, once detached from real value, becomes hollow. You are praised but not known. You are seen but not understood. And over time, this creates a subtle emptiness, because recognition without depth cannot satisfy the need for meaning. This is where the paradox sharpens. The more wealth becomes the measure of worth, the more individuals feel compelled to pursue it. And the more they pursue it, the more the standard reinforces itself, until an entire society orients around a distorted hierarchy, where appearance dominates essence, where accumulation overshadows character, where value is confused with visibility. Now consider the symbolic figure of a person who possesses great wealth but lacks internal clarity, surrounded by admiration, yet uncertain of their own worth, successful by external standards, yet disconnected from any stable sense of meaning. Through this figure, the illusion collapses. Wealth can elevate status, but it cannot secure identity. It can attract attention, but it cannot guarantee respect, because respect, in its deeper form, requires alignment between what one has and what one is, between external success and internal coherence. And when that alignment is absent, the individual experiences fragmentation, not always consciously, but persistently. Smith does not condemn wealth. He warns against its elevation into a moral standard, because once wealth becomes the primary measure, everything else is subordinated. Virtue becomes secondary. Integrity becomes optional. Character becomes invisible. And a society built on such a foundation begins to drift, not immediately, but inevitably, because its standards no longer reflect reality. They reflect perception. This is the synthesis. Wealth is a tool. But when it becomes a symbol of worth, it distorts judgment. Individuals begin to misjudge others. Society begins to misallocate admiration, and over time, the moral structure weakens. Not through direct attack, but through gradual misalignment. The text you provided reveals this danger clearly. Wealth is not inherently corrupting, but the way it is perceived and valued can lead to profound moral distortion. Everything now converges into a single point. You do not become corrupted by what you possess. You become corrupted by what you admire. And in the end, the most dangerous shift is not the accumulation of wealth. It is the moment when wealth replaces virtue as the measure of a human life. Chapter 9. Education is the last defense against the shrinking of the human being. Human beings do not remain whole by default. Left to the forces of efficiency, habit, and repetition, they narrow. Their thinking contracts. Their judgment weakens. Their inner world becomes thinner, more reactive, less capable of depth. What preserves the human being is not productivity, it is formation. Before modern education systems turned learning into credential and output, before societies equated knowledge with utility, Adam Smith had already seen a deeper necessity. When the world began to organize itself around commerce and specialization, he recognized a silent danger. A commercial society does not only create wealth, it risks producing incomplete human beings. This is the first rupture. Learning is not the same as training. Training prepares you to perform a function. It sharpens a specific ability. It makes you efficient within a defined role. But it does not expand your capacity to judge, to reflect, to understand beyond that role. Education, in its deeper sense, does something else. It widens you. It stretches your perception. It forces you to encounter perspectives beyond your immediate experience. It demands that you think not only about how to act, but about why you act. It interrupts the automatic. And without this interruption, the mind becomes mechanical. Smith understands this clearly. In a society driven by division of labor, individuals are increasingly confined to narrow tasks. Their daily activity does not require broad thinking. It rewards repetition, not reflection. And over time, this shapes the mind, not violently, but persistently. The person becomes adapted to the task, and what lies outside the task begins to fade. This is the second movement. Without deliberate education, the human being becomes reduced to function. You learn how to do, but not how to evaluate. You become skilled, but not necessarily wise. You operate effectively, but you do not question the structure within which you operate. This creates a dangerous imbalance. Because a society composed of highly trained individuals is not necessarily a society capable of sound judgment. It may produce, innovate, expand, but it may also fail to reflect, to correct, to recognize when it is moving in the wrong direction. And without recognition, error persists. Smith does not see education as luxury. He sees it as protection, a barrier against the narrowing forces of economic life, a way to preserve the breadth of human capacity in a system that naturally reduces it, not by opposing the system, but by balancing it. This is where the misunderstanding emerges. Modern societies often treat education as preparation for work, as a pathway to employment, as a means to secure position. And while these functions are real, they are incomplete, because they reduce education to utility, and utility alone cannot sustain a human being. You can be highly educated in the technical sense and still lack the ability to judge ethically. You can possess knowledge and lack perspective. You can process information and fail to understand its significance. This is the illusion of competence, and it is increasingly common. Now bring this into the present. In the world of 2025, access to information has expanded dramatically. Knowledge is available instantly. Skills can be acquired quickly. Systems are designed to optimize learning for efficiency. But something deeper is often missing: depth, the ability to sit with complexity, to resist immediate conclusions, to question assumptions, to engage with ideas that do not produce immediate reward. This form of education is slower, harder, less visible, and therefore less valued. So individuals gravitate toward what is rewarded. They acquire skills that are marketable. They learn what is necessary to function. They optimize for output. And in doing so, they align themselves with the system. But alignment is not the same as development, because development requires tension. It requires exposure to ideas that challenge you, to perspectives that disrupt your certainty, to questions that cannot be answered quickly. And without this tension, the mind remains within its existing structure. It does not grow. This is the third movement. Education is not accumulation. It is transformation. It changes how you see, not just what you know. It alters your capacity to interpret the world. It refines your judgment. It deepens your understanding of yourself and others. And this transformation cannot be reduced to output. It cannot be measured easily, which is why it is often neglected. But without it, something essential is lost: the ability to be a citizen, not in the legal sense, but in the moral sense. A citizen is not merely someone who participates in economic life. A citizen is someone who can evaluate that life, who can question its direction, who can recognize injustice, who can think beyond immediate interest. And this requires education in its fullest sense, because without it, individuals become passive within the system. They operate within its rules, but do not understand them. They follow patterns, but do not question their consequences. And a society of passive participants is fragile. It may function efficiently, but it lacks resilience. Now the psychological layer reveals itself. At the core of the resistance to true education lies discomfort. To expand your mind is to destabilize your current identity. To question what you believe is to risk uncertainty. To engage with complexity is to abandon simplicity. And the human mind resists this. It prefers clarity, certainty, immediate answers. It avoids what is difficult to process. It seeks closure. And so, it gravitates toward forms of learning that reinforce rather than challenge. This is not ignorance. It is self-preservation. But it has consequences. Because when you only learn what confirms you, you do not expand. You reinforce. And reinforcement creates rigidity. You become more certain, but not more accurate. More confident, but not more aware. This is the danger of shallow education. It produces individuals who believe they understand, but lack the depth to question their own understanding. Smith's vision cuts through this illusion. He sees education as a continuous process of self-correction, of expanding beyond one's immediate perspective, of maintaining the breadth of the human mind in a system that constantly pressures it to narrow. And this is not optional. It is necessary. Because without it, the forces of specialization, efficiency, and social conformity take over. They shape individuals into functions, into roles, into predictable patterns. And once this happens, something vital disappears: autonomy. Not the freedom to act, but the freedom to think, to step outside the system, to evaluate it, to choose consciously rather than react automatically. Now consider the symbolic figure of a highly skilled individual who lacks the ability to question their own environment. Efficient, productive, knowledgeable, but unable to step back, unable to reflect, unable to see beyond the immediate structure. Through this figure, the limitation becomes clear. Skill without education produces capability without direction, and direction matters, because without it, capability can be applied blindly. It can reinforce systems that should be challenged. It can sustain patterns that should be corrected, and the individual remains unaware. This is not failure, it is absence, the absence of formation. Now everything converges. A commercial society requires education not only to function, but to remain human, to prevent individuals from becoming mere instruments, to ensure that productivity does not replace thought, that efficiency does not eliminate reflection. Because once that elimination occurs, the system continues, but the human being diminishes. The text you provided makes this necessity explicit. Education is not an accessory to economic life. It is its counterbalance. Without it, the very forces that generate prosperity begin to erode the human capacity that sustains meaningful existence. And so, the final truth emerges with clarity. You are not defined by what you can do. You are defined by how far you can think beyond what you are trained to do. And in that distance, your humanity either expands or disappears. Chapter 10. A decent society is not built by markets alone. A society does not become just simply because it becomes rich. Wealth can expand, trade can flourish, and yet something essential can still fail. Prosperity without moral structure does not produce a good society. It produces a fragile one. Before modern political debates divided the world into opposing camps of state and market, before ideology simplified complex systems into rigid doctrines, Adam Smith had already seen the deeper tension. When the world began to celebrate commerce as a self-sufficient force, he exposed its limits. Markets can generate wealth. They cannot define the purpose of that wealth. This is the first rupture. Economic success is not moral success. Trade allows individuals to exchange, to specialize, to grow beyond subsistence. It creates interdependence. It connects lives across distance. It expands possibility. But it does not answer a more fundamental question. What should a society be? Markets respond to demand. They do not evaluate the worth of that demand. They facilitate exchange, but they do not determine whether what is exchanged contributes to human flourishing or merely satisfies immediate desire. This is where the boundary appears. The market is a mechanism. It is not a moral compass. Smith understands this clearly. He does not reject commerce. He recognizes its power, but he refuses to elevate it into a complete system. Because a system that produces wealth without guiding principles cannot sustain itself in the long term. It expands, but without direction. An expansion without direction leads to distortion. This is the second movement. A functioning society requires more than voluntary exchange. It requires structure. There must be rules that protect individuals from harm, institutions that ensure fairness, systems that provide what the market cannot efficiently produce, public goods that exist not because they are profitable, but because they are necessary. This includes justice. This includes education. This includes infrastructure. These are not optional. They are foundational. Without them, the conditions that allow markets to function begin to erode. Trust declines. Inequality intensifies. Access becomes uneven. And eventually, the system destabilizes. This is not theoretical. It is structural. Markets depend on conditions they do not create. And if those conditions are neglected, the system weakens from within. Now the misunderstanding becomes clear. Some believe that the state should control everything, that centralized authority can design and direct society toward optimal outcomes. But Smith rejects this. No single entity possesses enough knowledge to manage the complexity of human interaction. Centralized control suppresses adaptability. It replaces organic coordination with rigid planning. This leads to stagnation. But the opposite error is equally dangerous. The belief that the state should withdraw completely, that markets alone can organize society effectively, that individual pursuit of interest is sufficient to produce collective good. This leads to neglect, because certain goods cannot be provided through profit alone. Certain protections cannot emerge spontaneously. Certain inequalities cannot correct themselves without intervention. So the question sharpens: where does the role of the state end, and where does the role of the market begin? Smith does not offer a simple formula. He offers a principle: balance. The state must not replace society, but it must not disappear. It must create the conditions within which individuals can act freely while ensuring that those actions do not undermine the system itself. This is not control, it is maintenance. Now bring this into the present. In the world of 2025, this tension has intensified. Global trade expands. Digital markets evolve rapidly. Wealth is generated at unprecedented scale. But alongside this expansion, fractures appear. Inequality grows. Trust erodes. Institutions are questioned, and individuals feel both empowered and uncertain. This is not contradiction, it is consequence. Because when systems grow faster than the structures that support them, imbalance emerges. The market accelerates, but the frameworks that ensure fairness struggle to keep pace. And without adjustment, distortion deepens. This is the third movement. A decent society requires alignment between economic activity and moral structure. Wealth must not only be created, it must be situated within a system that recognizes human dignity, that enforces justice, that provides opportunity, that ensures that prosperity does not concentrate to the point where it destabilizes the whole. This is not about equality in the abstract. It is about sustainability. Because extreme imbalance does not remain contained, it affects trust, it affects cohesion, it affects the legitimacy of the system itself. And when legitimacy weakens, stability follows. Now the psychological dimension emerges. At the level of the individual, participation in a market system creates a certain mindset. You learn to evaluate, to compare, to maximize. You become attuned to value in economic terms. This is necessary. It allows you to function, but it also narrows perception. You begin to see the world through the lens of exchange, of cost and benefit, of gain and loss. And slowly, this lens extends beyond economics into other areas of life. Relationships become transactional. Decisions become calculated. Value becomes quantified. And something essential is lost: the ability to recognize worth beyond utility. Smith anticipates this danger. He understands that a society organized around commerce must actively preserve spaces where human value is not reduced to exchange, where dignity is not measured by productivity, where meaning is not defined by profit. Because without these spaces, the entire structure becomes imbalanced. Human beings become instruments, and when individuals feel reduced to instruments, they withdraw, they disengage, they lose trust in the system. This is not immediate, but it accumulates. Now consider the symbolic figure of a society that is materially prosperous but morally fragmented. Wealth is visible, opportunity exists, but trust is low. Institutions are weak. Individuals feel disconnected. Through this figure, the limitation becomes clear. Prosperity alone does not create cohesion. It must be supported by justice, by education, by shared standards that extend beyond economic success. This is the synthesis. Markets generate wealth. States maintain structure. Society provides meaning. And when these elements are aligned, a stable system emerges. Not perfect, not without tension, but capable of sustaining itself, capable of adapting, capable of supporting human life in its full complexity. But when they diverge, problems arise. Too much control and freedom collapses. Too little structure and order dissolves. Too much focus on wealth and value distorts. Smith's vision is not ideological, it is diagnostic. He sees that human systems are fragile, that they require continuous adjustment, that no single mechanism can carry the entire weight of society. And this leads to the final confrontation. What kind of society are you participating in? One that prioritizes growth without reflection? One that enforces control without freedom? Or one that attempts to balance competing forces, knowing that no balance is permanent? Because you are not outside this structure. You contribute to it through your actions, through your expectations, through what you accept and what you challenge. The text you provided makes this unavoidable. A good society is not defined by wealth alone, but by how that wealth is integrated into a broader moral and institutional framework. Everything now converges into a single truth. A society does not fail when it becomes poor. It fails when it forgets what its wealth is for. And in that moment, prosperity becomes empty, and the structure begins to collapse from within. A society does not collapse because it lacks wealth. It collapses because it loses the ability to judge what wealth is for. And behind every economic structure, every system of exchange, every pursuit of success, there remains a deeper and more demanding question. What kind of human being is being formed through all of this? Adam Smith does not offer comfort. He does not allow us to hide behind the illusion that markets alone can organize a good life, or that good intentions alone can sustain a just society. He reveals something more unsettling. Human beings are always suspended between forces they do not fully control and responsibilities they cannot escape. Between sympathy and bias, between self-interest and moral restraint, between efficiency and inner erosion. At the center of all this stands a fragile truth. Morality is not guaranteed. It must be constructed. It begins with the ability to imagine others, but it does not end there. It demands that we judge ourselves from a distance, that we confront the limits of our own feelings, that we discipline our desires without denying them. It requires that we recognize the systems we participate in, even when we did not design them. It forces us to see that every gain carries a cost, and every structure shapes the people within it. And most importantly, it refuses to let us separate success from responsibility. Because a society built only on interest becomes cold. A society built only on sentiment becomes unstable. A society built only on efficiency becomes empty. What Smith uncovers is not a solution, but a tension that must be lived, a balance that cannot be fixed once and for all, between freedom and structure, between individual ambition and collective order, between wealth and worth. This is not a problem to solve. It is a condition to face. In the world of 2025, this tension has not disappeared. It has intensified. We are more connected, yet more fragmented. More productive, yet more uncertain. More informed, yet less grounded. And beneath all of it, the same question persists, sharper than before. Can a society grow without losing its soul? The answer does not lie in systems alone. It lies in the people who inhabit them, in whether they are capable of sympathy without illusion, of judgment without arrogance, of ambition without corruption, of success without forgetting what gives it meaning. The text you provided leads to this unavoidable conclusion. Economics is never just about exchange. It is always about human beings trying to live together under conditions of tension, limitation, and desire. And in the end, everything converges into a single, inescapable truth. You are not only shaped by the world you live in, you are responsible for what that world becomes. And at that point, there is no longer any place to hide.